that I find really interesting about this entire water system here is sort of this retention pond you see on the left. That's a storm water outfall. So all of the storm drains from all these neighborhoods here, Denver and Aurora, end up there, and then the second pond a little way down. So it's not sewage, but it's street runoff. So there'll be tons and tons of trash, especially after a big storm. And we often get, comments like, "Oh, Bluff Lake's looks so trashy," and this and that, not realizing that it's coming from the neighborhoods and we're sort of part of the solution. So we have put up a lot more signage explaining the process, but the idea is the water is naturally filtered a bit by this whole setup. So for a while it sits in that retention pond, and a lot of the sediments and things sit to the bottom, and then the water's flowing through a green braided fence, which isn't super visible from here, but we can walk a little bit that way so you can see it. And that's kind of straining out a bunch of trash. So we have volunteers who are consistently coming to clean that up. We're always looking for volunteers for that. And sometimes the city does come to take that away as well. Then the water and small pieces of trash that make it through that still have to go through this whole cattail marsh before it re-enters the ecosystem at the lake. So the cattails are further physically straining the trash, but also they're kind of taking some of the chemicals out of it because they suck up the water with the pollutants, and then by the time they're releasing it back into the atmosphere, they're not releasing those pollutants. So I doubt it's amazing for the cattails, but they are, really helping improve that water quality. So that's kind of just what we're looking at here. I guess I'd like to talk about water rights while we're in this area. So kind of to the right, the whole right of the lake running along the northern border, that is not only a trail, but it was reinforced as a dam in 2015 or so. So previously, this lake didn't used to hold water year-round. In the summer, it would dry up, so it wasn't a good aquatic habitat, it wasn't a good wetland habitat for migrating birds. But after this dam project, now the water is retained all year. That's had a lot of consequences, some good, some bad. First of all, it's become a really nice haven for wetland wildlife, turtles, frogs, all kinds of birds. And it's also become a big migration point for a lot of waterfowl and other migrating birds. So since that time, the bird sightings have really kind of exploded. We've had like 219 species, different species have been sighted here total, and that's going up pretty regularly. There's a birding group that's very active. They've been meeting on the first Saturday of every month for probably 5 years or so. So they're the ones who are really kind of keeping track of those new birds, and community science is really what's kind of informed our knowledge of some of the wildlife here. So in terms of other consequences, first of all, the water from the lake is no longer kind of constantly leaching to the north, where there's a lot of cottonwood trees, and those cottonwood trees were really spoiled when they were growing up. Their roots were wet all the time. So now they're really kind of struggling to develop these deeper root systems now that the water is not as constant. So that's kind of the give and take. We've helped one habitat, not so much the other. The other thing is just the really interesting labyrinth that is water rights in Colorado. So basically every drop of water in Colorado is accounted for by somebody at all times. It's a huge area and there's not that much water here. So this water is not owned by us, it's owned by the city and by people who are downstream in Sand Creek. So this water eventually ends up across the path and into Sand Creek, which runs sort of parallel to our site. But now it's retained for longer. The only way it really gets into Sand Creek is when the lake level gets high enough that it spills through an overflow over into the creek. Because of that, we are now having some evaporation and losing some of the water. So believe it or not, we need to keep track of the amount of evaporation. We're keeping track of the surface area, the depth, air pressure, things like that. And there's a calculation to calculate how much water we're losing by retaining this. And then we basically owe to the water rights holders for that amount. So the options are either to make payments or to add water. So those are kind of options that's still being legally navigated. We're hoping eventually to have a source of recycled water that we can add to the creek as needed. But this has been kind of an ongoing legal hot mess. So if you see there's a red fox that hangs around. We often have coyotes. They'll either be kind of traveling Sand Creek, or I think 2 summers ago there was one that was kind of raising her pups in this prairie area. Deer, mule deer are really common. Again, it seems like a lot of things travel along Sand Creek and then they'll kind of end up in this wooded area. And then of course the ever-present prairie dogs, which we can talk more about in a second. And then just lots and lots of birds. Probably the most common visible hawks are a red-tailed hawk. Those are the ones that can be here all year, and kind of the leading edge of their wings is dark. And then Swainson hawks are only here in the summer. They migrate, I want to say Ecuador in the winter. It's really far. And then they're the back of their wings is dark. So those are the 2 hawks we see the most often. If you see a little one that has like a teardrop, that's an American kestrel. So those are a falcon. But yeah, those are kind of the birds we're seeing around. I'm trying to think if there's any other major animals.
You guys have skunks?
Oh, that's a good question. I've never seen one, but this is definitely part of their natural range. And then all kinds of bugs, which is very exciting for kids. It's one of our most popular activities are bug hunts. Frogs, turtles, there's a bunch of turtles. So the western painted turtle is the one that is native to Colorado. And then there's one called the red-eared slider that is really similar, except it has little red patches here, and it's a little bigger, it reproduces a little earlier, a little stronger, so it's kind of pushing out the western painted turtle. And hilariously, in 2001 in Britain, it was revealed that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were red-eared sliders. So all of a sudden it becomes like a really popular pet. And then as people realize, they get big, they don't want it anymore, a lot were released into the wild, which is kind of how we got into this mess. But we've seen both kind of turtles here. We also have a big snapping turtle that tends to hang around over on the far end of the lake. And once I saw a spiny softshell turtle, which I didn't even know what it was. It's got like this crazy long nose, and its shell, instead of being hard, like, it's like leathery. So yeah, those are some of the interesting wildlife we have. And if you're interested on your way out, I made a brochure that's more specific to this site. So instead of being like, animals of North America or animals of Colorado, they're all things that I have personally seen, in the last 3 years or so.
They don't have beavers here much, do they?
We do have beavers, we absolutely do.
I didn't see any dam, that's why I'm curious.
So we do not have a dam, but upstream in Sand Creek, probably, 2 miles or so, they built a big lodge. And then like a whole series of dams. But we do get tons of beavers here as well. They're mostly nocturnal, which is why we don't see them, although we have seen one. And they've been both in the creek, in the lake, and over by the outfall.
They can be kind of destructive.
Yes, they're very destructive. So we'll find tons of chewed down trees, which is at the same time exciting and not so great. So one thing that you may notice if you ever walk the full site is a lot of the trees, the bottom yard or so, is a darker color. That's because one of the service projects we've had done periodically is painting of the trees to protect them from beavers. So it's a mixture of brown or gray paint with sand, and the beavers don't like chewing through that. So that's kind of what that's all about. We get lots of questions about that. But yes, beavers are one of my favorites. I may have information sheets about all the different animals and the beavers. It's like part 1 of 4, so.
On the Sand Creek along here.
Yes.
Did you or whomever make those little dams in there?
Yes, awesome question. So those were man-made. They were added by the city of Denver. I want to say, let me actually check my dates here, because that'll be coming up. around 1994. It was part of a big expansion project, which I can tell you more about in a second, but those are there for a few reasons. Obviously, they look nice and sort of control the water flow, but also that tumbling water is adding oxygen to the water. And dissolved oxygen is super important for aquatic life. So it's actually serving a really important purpose of, allowing to see lots of crayfish, some minnows, all kinds of things like that is possible in part because of this, especially because historically this creek had low oxygen levels. So the reason for that, I guess, before this was Bluff Lake Nature Center, backing up in history a little bit, let me check my dates. Okay, in 1929, Denver purchased a big parcel of land to make the Denver Municipal Airport. So you may be able to see, oh, look at that. Really far away, the tall thing kind of in the center is the airport tower. And kind of everything from there out toward this direction was the airport. In 1940, this land was added to that airport. So it was a crash zone, because you have to have a certain amount of land at the end of a runway before you can have residences. But they also did a lot of solid waste disposal here. So ethanol glycol, I believe it's called, or glycol ethanol, which they used to sort of de-ice planes, was a big problem. They had retention ponds, but they weren't working adequately, so they'd often spill over into the creek and get that oxygen level really low. So as a result of that, the Sierra Club in 1994 sued the city of Denver, and part of the settlement was that this became Bluff Lake Nature Preserve. So it was still owned by the airport at first, and the Friends of Bluff Lake were managing it. So the city at that time put like $3 million of work into making this place, restoring it to wildlife refuge as part of the settlement. That included, we think, the drop structure, all the trails, there's a boardwalk onto the lake, this open air amphitheater, all that stuff. But the city didn't account for adding public and educational programming. So that's when the Friends of Bluff Lake were formed and started adding those things in. It wasn't until, I think, 2008. Yes, in 2008, the Friends of Bluff Lake actually got ownership rights to this property. So now we're a self-owned nonprofit. So this isn't a city property. We don't get tax money. It's not a city park. So that's why we can have a little bit different rules from the parks in terms of dogs and things like that. So other improvements have been made to the property since then. The boardwalk was redone in 2008. The dam project we already talked about. We've also added a nature playground. This was just completed this summer, which is very exciting, but you can see, let's see if you can see any of the sites here. Down there, there's a bunch of stumps close together. They create kind of like stairs or jumping stones. For kids, we call it the Stumpatheater. In those trees there, it's partially visible but not super visible, is a shelter building area. So we have sort of the framework of a large structure that's more permanent, and then kids and families can kind of build and unbuild the walls. Yeah, that's a popular one. And actually, there right now, you can see some sort of tarps, or maybe you can't, but that is probably the Denver Forest School. So that is not a Bluff Lake run program, but they work with us, have permission to be on our site, and they just have nursery school outside. So the kids are here for like 3 to 6 hours, Monday to Friday, all year. They're really tough. Like, they will be here in the winter, they will be here in the snow. When it rains, they'll put up little tarps. Yeah, so that's them. Other than that, here during the day, we don't allow camping or anything like that overnight. We're closed at night. Let's see, other play structures are, there's a dirt hill that you can climb. There's like a pole with a rope, so it's a climbing hill. There are these really cute Prairie Dog Tunnels. They're large PVC pipe sections that actually are buried underground, so the kids can go through. And then on your way out, you might see there's a big hawk's nest. So there's a ladder up to a platform, and then it's surrounded by a bunch of sticks that kids can play in, and it's about the size of a real eagle's nest, which is huge. Yeah. So just take a look at that on your way out. They're surprisingly big. So yeah, those were kind of some of the improvements and how we ended up where we are today. So we serve about 4,000 students in person per year, at least before 2020. And in 2020, we served about 9,000 students virtually that year. And also in 2020, our visitor count increased by about 50%. So we were one of the outdoor spaces that didn't need to close because we are outdoor, there's plenty of room for social distancing. People were really desperate for ways to get outside. So we were really happy to be able to be an important resource for the community during that time. We're also hoping to grow. As those of you who use the bathroom probably notice, we don't have indoor spaces, running water, plumbing, things like that. So the goal in the next handful of years is to have an actual visitor center where we could take classes inside when the weather's not great. We can greet visitors, we can do things like that. And we were really lucky in 2020 to get $1 million endowment from the David Smith Family Foundation, and we're hoping to run a capital campaign in this coming year. We need $6 million to do all these campus improvements, a big one of which is going to be adding shade. We have summer camp programs, and it's just 95 degrees every day without fail. So we're kind of hopping from shady area to shady area. So we're hoping to get, a few more open air roofs in the property. We are open to the public every day, including holidays, from sunrise to sunset, completely free. So a big part of our mission is trying to serve diverse communities. We are right in the middle of an urban area, which is fairly unique for a wildlife refuge. So the really great part about that is schools and neighborhoods that wouldn't necessarily have access to, a cabin in the mountains can still take the bus ride here. And a really large portion of our programs are grant funded by Great Outdoors Colorado. So we can reimburse busing and offer those programs for free for schools and students that need them. Yeah, but it is open all year. Really, our only paid programs are we have an after-school program, although even that the fees are waived depending on socioeconomic circumstances. And then summer camp programs, which is about a third of our annual income. But again, we offer 30 to 50 scholarship spots for that. This past summer, we served 400 kids, and we had 400 on the waiting list. So really, we've never filled before. Let's see, 2019, I don't think we'd ever filled. 2020, just full immediately. 2021, we were full by February 1st of this year for camp starting in June. So, I would have loved people to serve more, but we're really limited by storm shelter capacity. Were something to happen, we all are trying to cram into that tiny building you saw. Dogs have a really complex language, actually. It's one of the most complex animal languages. They'll go so far as to different people who visit regularly will have different calls. Or there's a different warning call for a red-tailed hawk versus a coyote. I don't speak full prairie dog, but I've been told that when they're kind of going, their tail's going and they're going yip 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 yip, that's a warning call. And if they jump up and show their belly and go woo, that's an all clear signal. So I love the prairie dogs. I know they're a big, contentious issue in Colorado, but I guess a few things to notice about this colony in particular. All of these houses across the street, these didn't exist 5 years ago. And the ones a little bit farther that way, those didn't exist 1 year ago. So all of these prairie dogs are very, very condensed, more than they really should be. And as a result of that, you can see there's not a lot of greenery or grass. In ideal conditions, prairie dogs just kind of trim down the grass like a lawnmower. So that's their food source, and then it's that way so they can see the predators. In this case, there's actually areas you can see that they're digging up the roots to eat them. So in that case, they're not necessarily bouncing back. We have great horned owls that nest here sometimes, which is really exciting. And then bald eagles, they don't nest here, but they tend to come through, in February-ish. Another thing you may have noticed is there's a couple places, including one here, where the rabbits have dug under the fence. You can kind of see, if you look closely, you can kind of see the front where they're really frequently running. The reason I know it's a rabbit is because often there's scat, and rabbits have this little round circular. I also like to use this have an opportunity to talk about sort of trail rules. So until I started working here, I guess I didn't really fully understand the importance of staying on trail. But the problem is social trails just grow really rapidly. And a lot of times they grow from game trails like this. So something like this, say it wasn't a rabbit, say it was a deer, it can start to look big enough that you think it's a trail. And then people start taking it, and now it's a person trail and not so good for deer anymore. So there's signs, another ongoing battle of the site manager is just putting up signage to say, like, please stay in this area. And it's hard because it's really exciting. Like, the birders especially love to get right up against Sand Creek because that's where they see tons of cool birds. So it's sort of a balancing act between, education and trying to enjoy nature while at the same time trying to preserve the nature. So yeah, feel free to take a look at that as you go past. Also, this little area with the brick is where we found a lot of our bull snake shed skin. So that they'll shed their skin, and we found like tons and tons of their crusty dried skins. I mean, everywhere in the prairie, but I know I found at least 2 or 3. This one's called cheatgrass. Right now, it's not as easy to detect. But one of the problems with this one is it goes dry well before the other plants. So it's really extending the wildfire risk season. So we actually, with the summer camp kids, will have cheatgrass calling competitions. There's a certain time of year where they're really easily ID'd because they're red. So they're like kind of red and droopy, and the kids really like that. So that's a plant that you can see. Somebody else pointed out the American licorice, that you can kind of see like a greener patch right there. They're the ones that have these kind of red seed heads. These are what are called hitchhiker seeds. So if an animal or a person walks by, they'll tend to grab on. They're kind of, they're not poking unless you like really squeeze them, but they work like Velcro, and the idea is that's how they are spreading. Other kind of seed methods of spreading are the cattails. Well, we talked about already about the milkweed. They use wind dispersal, and the cattails do that as well. So the cattails are the ones that have what look like fuzzy corn dogs, and then those will just become more and more explodey at certain times of the year. So I'll leave some of these over here in case anybody wants. This one's called Bindweed. And actually, it's really pretty white and pink flowers in the summer. It's the one that's like, it like crawls up the fence or any other plants.
Morning glory.
Yeah, they're a lot like morning glories. It's like a invasive version of a morning glory, and there's a huge problem in gardens in this area too. And you just cannot kill it. Like we put cardboard down in our garden to like reset a pot. We lifted it up, and there was this stuff just milk white, like pure white, but still alive. But anyways, yeah, it's really, really pretty. But so actually, this is something we'll use for art projects with the kids, just because it really shouldn't be there, but it is really pretty. So when we're trying to do things with peaceful nature, we try to leave no trace. So we'll try to grab cheatgrass when we're doing our nature paintbrushes, where you make paintbrush out of grass. We'll try to grab bindweed. Making our sun pictures, just to kind of make sure our impact is neutral or positive. Various degree. First of all, human history, I think this is really interesting. It's only been like the last 15,000 years out of a 4.5 billion Earth existence. So if you put that on a football field, and the whole of the football field is the whole of the Earth's existence, people's existence would be like 1/8 of an inch. So it seems like I'm covering a lot. But that's when we got involved. But this area, I don't know a ton about geological history, but if anyone's interested, I do have some handouts. But it was covered by glaciers. Kind of the last ice age ended about 12,000 years ago. So as this area sort of, the glaciers melted, the Rocky Mountains were covered. We started to get lakes and streams and things like that. And the first people know about in North America were referred to as Paleo Indians. So these are the people who are coming over from North Asia across the Bering Strait land bridge. And at first they're hunting really big mammals. So like mammoth, mastodon, giant sloth, ancient buffalo, which would be bigger. But then as this area continued to, there were some ups and downs. Basically we continued to get warmer and drier as time went on. So then all of the really big animals became extinct because there just wasn't enough food and water. So then the people needed to start hunting smaller animals. So at this point we get modern buffalo, deer, antelope, things like that. And people also start adding plants to their diet. So, and actually one of the most extensive archaeological sites of these alien people I've discovered is actually in Larimer County, Colorado. So it's called the Bindweed site. It's just a really big site where they have a really rich source of artifacts. Okay, so after that we're at about 8,500 years ago, 1,200 years ago. This is sort of the precursor of what we know as more modern Native American tribes. So in this area of Colorado, everybody was pretty much nomadic or semi-nomadic. So they're moving around a lot. Sometimes you would find shelters that they built either as a temporary shelter or more often as a seasonal shelter. So it's like often a lot of people are taking shelter in the foothills when it's cold, and then doing a lot of hunting when it's warm. Or they do people in the mountains, they do the mountains in the summer when it wasn't as cold, and then again the plains. So this wasn't a super well-known period, but actually Vail Pass, there's a rest stop off the I-70, and it turns out that that used to be one of the most well-used temporary campsites of this entire period. So it's kind of been subsumed, and a lot of the campsites that we stay have been used for like thousands of years. Okay, so now we're in early, skip a little bit here. Okay, around 1300 is when we started to get it, what we now recognize as more modern Native American tribes. Really the first people in this area were the Beavers. So they came in, they were originally in California, they came in from the west, and really were dominating the mountains and the whole kind of western area of the state, and they really held out for like 600 years. So they were not, when the Spanish came, they wanted no part of that, they were really kind of holding this area pretty strongly. Then the Apache came in from the north, they were in Minnesota and North Dakota, and then they sort of were splitting the state. So the Ute were on the west, the Apache were on the east, and then I believe next were either the Comanche or the Shoshone. They're close to be related, and honestly, it was hard. The research is difficult because all these people were so nomadic, and there was just like dozens of different people kind of sharing the plains. Plus, there weren't a lot of archaeological artifacts left behind, and also as settlers came, there was sort of this chain reaction of displacement as like we move west, now we move west. So not a ton of specific details are hard to come by. But anyways, we've got our Ute and our Apache, the Comanche and Shoshone coming from the north and kind of shove the Apache downward. And then after that, the Arapaho and Cheyenne come in and shove that downward. So this is all tribes that are just using the Great Plains for hunting or temporarily. Other ones that were in and out were Navajo, Sioux, Kiowa. Those are the ones I can remember. I think that's most of them. The only Native American tribes that were permanent settling, yes, were in the southwest part of the state, in the Four Corners area. I'm sorry, southeast in the Four Corners area, and that was the Bluff Lake people. So that's where you're getting those big areas. So, okay, meanwhile, as this is all happening, in about the mid-1500s, we start getting the Spanish coming in. They were really kind of like the most prolific explorers in Colorado. What do I want to say about that? Check my years here. Okay, so in 1598, the Spanish conquistadors found New Mexico as a colony. And Colorado is included in that area of what they control. So that remains theirs until Mexico wins independence in 1821, and then the U.S. defeats Mexico in 1845. Yeah. 48. Somewhere in I check it out since you're so specific. Might be able to find find it under pressure like this. But anyways, so the settlers are kind of intermingling with the Native Americans at this point. Sometimes this is peaceful, there's trade, a lot of times it's not, there's conflict, especially when the gold rush happened, which I believe was 1858. All of a sudden there's just a huge influx of settlers. So this kind of conflict increased and eventually became the Colorado War, which I believe was roughly the time of the Civil War, like 1861, 1865-ish. This is basically Native American people against the U.S. government. A really famous battle that you may have heard of before was the Sand Creek Massacre. First of all, this is not our Sand Creek. For confusion purposes, there are 3 Sand Creeks in Colorado. So we've got this one here that's about 14 miles. There's one in Fort Collins, and then the one that this was actually on was Big Sandy Creek, is what it's now called. So, but this massacre was basically, it was called Black Kettle was the town, and there was U.S. Army basically just decimated this town, even though it was mostly women and children, for 2/3. At the time, it was seen as like a great victory, but now it's sort of, you know, over time it was really looked down as like this atrocious genocide. So there is now a historical site about 180 miles southwest of here, southeast. I forget what town it was. So anyways, this war continues. There's a few treaties that try to happen. The treaties of 1851 to 1861, basically the Cheyenne and Arapaho are getting like smaller and smaller areas, and ultimately most of the tribes are pushed out. The exception is that you have 2 reservations in southwest Colorado. So that being said, there are still a lot of Native American people in the area, you know, who are active and part of their heritage. And my understanding is the population of Colorado is about 1%